All right, welcome back to another video, everybody. Today I'm going to be giving you guys another deck tech for the historic format. This deck is called Boros Keld Control. If you've watched some of my videos, this is a deck that I did a deck tech on and played in Pioneer. And I've transferred the list over to the historic format and made the necessary adjustments. It does transfer over pretty well. And so, kind of the premise behind this deck is that it's a control based deck. We're using a lot of mass removal spells to clear the board of creatures. And then we also have ways of dealing with like planeswalkers and stuff like that. And we utilize the Flame of the Keld to kind of keep things going in this deck, and then there's some inherent synergies that work with this card and the rest of our deck here. And so, yeah, I think the best way to explain how this deck functions is just by going through each of the card choices individually here. Um, so at the lower end of our curve, we start with our two converted mana cost cards, and that would be Birth of Meltease. And this is a way to help fix our mana. You get a search for basic planes in your on the first chapter of the saga, and then you get to create a wall, which is nice, and gain 2 life. And the wall helps you protect things like Gideon from attackers and stuff like that. Um, and then we got the Flame of Keld, which we talked about a little bit. The first chapter says you discard your hand and then you draw 2 cards on the second chapter. And then on the third chapter, it says if a red source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player this turn, deals that much damage +2. So we're not really emptying our hand super quick. It's not one of those dump your hand, play this. But the thing about Boros control in general is that you have a lot of cards that might not be very good for certain matchups. So, like if you're playing against a control deck, your Deafening Clarions and your Shatter the Skies are going to be dead cards in your hand. So, having a way to just pitch that and then draw more cards is actually pretty good. And also with Elspeth Conquers Death, if you pitch a creature or a planeswalker with Flame of the Keld, then on the third chapter of this saga, you'll be able to reanimate it. So there's some synergy there. Also, on the third chapter, the +2 damage works quite good with our Bone Crusher Giants. Bone Crusher Giant would deal, its Stomp would deal 4 damage. If it attacks in, it does 6. Deafening Clarion would deal 5 damage to all creatures, and Rekindling Phoenix can attack in for 6 there as well. So it's pretty good. And then on to the next card, Banishing Light, just a kind of catch-all removal spell here. There is some synergy with enchantments as well in this deck. Then we got Gideon Blade, and this card is really good because none of our mass removal kills it, and it can also give one of our other creatures indestructible if we use a mass removal spell. And so typically, Boros doesn't have very good card advantage, and that's why Boros control kind of like legs out. That's the reason we're running Flame of the Keld. But then we also get to cantrip with Shatter the Sky and still keep our board. That's kind of one of the main focuses around this deck is building around the card Shatter the Sky and having creatures that are resilient that will both draw you a card and remain on the board. So Gideon works really well with that. He's just an indestructible 4/4 when it's your turn, and he can also offer Vigilance, Lifelink, indestructible to another creature you control, which is pretty cool. So then we got Bone Crusher Giant. This card works extremely well. Flame of the Keld. Not only because you can just use a stomp and then it's off in exile, so that when you use Flame of the Keld, you still got a card you can cast off to the side, which is quite good. Also a 4/3 fits with our 4 power theme here. as well, and just a good all-around solid card. So then we got Deafening Clarion, one of our mass removal spells here, using both the 3 damage to all creatures and the lifelink is quite relevant. We got Gideon, so we can give him lifelink and swing in and clear the board, which is quite good. And then we got Shatter the Sky, which we talked about. Another mass removal spell. Works well with our 4 power creature theme in our deck here. And then we got Rekindling Phoenix. And this card is just really great. Not just in this deck specifically, but it's a really good against control. It's hard for them to remove. It's a great blocker. And yeah, it's a very difficult card to deal with. And all of our removal will kill it, but we should get it back unless they destroy our token, which can happen, but it's not the end of the world. And then we got Cavalier of Dawn. This is a cool addition to this deck. So what this says is when Cavalier of Dawn enters the battlefield, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token. And then when Cavalier of Dawn dies, you get to return a target artifact or enchantment to your hand from your graveyard. To your hand. And so this card is just a great little catch-all removal spell, one, when it comes down for anything that's hard for us to deal with on their side of the board. It can also just, if there's nothing to remove on their side, turn one of our walls into a 3/3, and then we just have another threat on the board there, which is good. And then it also, we're not really too worried about the 3/3 on their side of the board because we got all this mass removal. Deafening Clarion will kill that creature amongst their other creatures, but then Cavalier Dawn will stay alive, which is quite good. And then also, if we happen to use a Shadow of the Sky or they kill it, we can recur one of our enchantments. That all these sagas, they put themselves in the graveyard, which ends up working up really great with Cavalier of Dawn. And so if we end up tossing any enchantments with Flavor of the Keld, or they just reach the end of their chapters and put themselves in the graveyard, then we get some recursion there. The coolest recursion loop kind of being with Elsbeth Conquers Death. And so when this card comes down, you get to exile a permanent an opponent controls with converted mana cost 3 or greater. And then their non-creature spells cost 2 more to cast on the next turn. And then on the final chapter, you get to return a planeswalker or creature from your graveyard to the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on it or a loyalty counter on it. So you can kind of create this loop with Cavalier of Dawn and Elsbeth Conquers Death, which is quite good. And that's ends up being pretty useful in really grindy matchups. So that's the main core of the deck there. We're running 26 lands, pretty standard white-red lands. We're using the best ones possible. 1 Castle Ardenvale. One important piece of this deck is Bonder's Enclave. We're running 3 of those, and it just taps for colorless mana, but then for 3 mana, we can tap it to draw a card, and we activate that ability only if we control a creature with power 4 or greater. And that's kind of the theme of our deck. We got all these creatures that are 4 or greater in our deck, and including Gideon, and that's another way that we can just gain card advantage in a Boros shell. So yeah, that's the gist of the deck there. Onto the sideboard. In the sideboard, we're running 3 Soul Guide Lantern to deal with opponents' graveyards, 2 Fries for control matchups, a couple Banishing Lights for when our creature removal stuff isn't so good. Got 3 Blood Suns for Field of the Dead decks, 2 Chandras for control, another Immortal Sun for Planeswalker, Super Friends decks and control and stuff like that, and 2 Heliod's Interventions for enchantments and artifacts. And so the core of this deck, it's actually really good against creature-based decks, one. And actually not that bad against control matchups either. It can grind out with control. Definitely controls a little bit tougher of a matchup than creature matchup. So the most of our sideboard is kind of focused on the control matchup there. But yeah, that's the deck. It's a really fun deck to play. It's actually really good in this current historic meta. I'll leave a link in the description for this deck so you can import it into Arena here if you want to play it. And stay tuned because I'll be putting out some videos of gameplay of this deck very soon. Thanks a lot, guys. We'll see you next time.